Can you hear me? Okay, great. So first of all, thank you. Thank you, Stephanie and Avra, for making this lunch happen, this Lunch and Learn happen. Thank you to a special shout out to Hadassah Women's Foundation for their constant support of the Center for Women's Justice almost from its inception. And thank you, Michelle and Rachel from CWJ, without whom this wonderful video would not have been created. My talk today is entitled, "Is Israel a democracy or a theocracy?" So the quick answer to that question is that Israel is a hybrid democracy. It is a partial theocracy. In Israel, women can be fighter pilots, but they can't get divorced. To some extent, Israel is a very robust democracy. But in this one limited area in marriage and divorce, Israel is a theocracy. Religious courts have exclusive jurisdiction over marriage and divorce. Religious clerics determine marriage and divorce in accordance with religious rules. My thesis statement today, what I would like you to go away with is that Israel's hybrid democracy, its partial theocracy, is significantly flawed. There's no rule of law, there's an arbitrary use of power, and there's chaos. But nonetheless, there is hope. Change is in the air. Israel does have a robust civil society, including us at the Center for Women's Justice. They have a robust press, and it has civil courts that when pushed to the wall will protect women's rights. So first, what I would like to do to prove this thesis statement is to describe the 5 cases that you've already seen in more detail, and then after I make that, do that, I will tell you what we did for them. It's at the Center for Women's Justice, or what we're still doing for them. So the first case is, okay. The first case is Tzviya. Tzviya is the most famous Agunah in the state of Israel today. She sued for divorce in the year 2000. In 2002 already, the Rabbinic Court put her husband in jail in the effort to persuade him to agree to divorce. And all during the years that he was in jail, the court did everything it could to try and persuade him to agree to the religious divorce for the get. They took away his canteen privileges. They took away his religious privileges. They would not let him sleep on a mattress. They put him in solitary confinement, but nothing worked. And in 2020, Tzviya got really sick of going to the rabbinic courts every few months and thought that her children were really better off having jail. And she asked the rabbinic courts to close her file and to release her husband from prison. So it's 22 years since she first asked for a get, since she first filed for divorce, and she's lived apart from her husband all that time. In the eyes of the state, Tzviya is still married, and she's still responsible for her husband's debts, and she still can't remarry. In a theocracy, there are no clear rules and no clear and no predictable rules. No rules that can guarantee divorce for Jewish women. No rules as to why, when, and which men will be put in jail for get refusal, for divorce refusal, or for how long. Second case, the second case that we saw in the film is the case of Ella. Ella was a religious woman who became secular, and her husband remained ultra-Orthodox. And Ella desperately wanted a divorce from her husband, and so she agreed to a draconian divorce agreement, which she described a bit in the film. And that agreement denied her the right to go to civil court or to the police, and it penalized her if she did. And in response, after she got her divorce, the rabbinic courts, at the request of her husband, first the rabbinic court ratified this draconian agreement, and then they enforced the agreement when she went to the police and awarded her husband damages of significant amounts of 120,000 shekels. The court also denied Ella custody of her sons. It canceled support payments for her daughters, saying that the husband did not have to finance the daughter's secular lifestyle, and it denied Ella the right to live with her partner. It declared it gave a decision saying that she couldn't live in the same house unmarried with a man. And the reason she couldn't marry this particular man was because he was a Kohen, and the state will not allow a divorced woman to marry a Kohen. So that is Ella's case. The next case that we saw briefly was the case of Rebecca. Rebecca was in a battered women's shelter, and she wanted a divorce. And in exchange for the divorce, her husband demanded that she live near him. In other words, she wouldn't give him a divorce unless she agreed that after the divorce, she would continue to live next to him or in the same area with him. And the rabbinic courts, agreed and tried to pressure Rebecca into acceding to her husband's conditions. So here we see that in a theocracy run by men, the courts are often tone deaf to issues of domestic violence, and men run the show. In other words, one of the other things that we often overlook when we talk about Israel's theocracy is that rabbinic courts are all run by men, and they're all run by religious men. So by definition, women cannot be judged before a court of peers, and secular people cannot also be judged by a court of peers, because it's only religious Orthodox rabbis that run the courts. The next case that you saw in your video was the case of Masha. Masha is an immigrant from the former Soviet Union, and what she went to the court for was simply to arrange for her divorce. She and her husband had agreed to divorce. It was an amicable divorce. They have a divorce agreement, and after the agreement was authorized by the civil court, they went to the rabbinic courts and asked them to arrange for divorce. So the rabbinic courts refused. And because what they wanted to do was they demanded a rehearing of the wife's Jewish status, even though the rabbinic courts had originally okayed her Jewish status because she needed to have an okay in order to be allowed to get married. But the rabbinic courts have now changed their rules when it comes to the people from the former Soviet Union, and they're much more aggressive in investigating the Jewish status. And they took this opportunity where they saw a woman from the former Soviet Union who had been investigated under easier rules, perhaps, and demanded that she undergo further investigation as a precondition for the state conducting her divorce. So here is where we see that in the theocracy, the rules are always changing. The courts don't always obey their own rules, because in this particular case, the rule is that if you got married through the rabbinate, you don't have to go through an investigation upon divorce. But they found a loophole in their own rule, and they're trying to request that she go through that investigation again. And in Israel, sadly, the Israeli theocracy is prejudiced against immigrants from the former Soviet Union. And then there's case number 5 that you saw, which was the father and daughter. Okay, that's Talia and Oren. And in this case, Oren has been fighting for the state to recognize him as Talia's daughter for literally all her life. Talia was born 8.5 months after her mother's divorce. And in Israel, if a child is born within 10 months of a divorce, the child can only be registered as the daughter of the ex-husband. And Oren is not recognized by the state as Talia's father, and the ex-husband is not someone that either Talia or her mother wants to have in any way involved with her life. In this particular case, because of that, Talia is actually registered as not having any father at all. Oren filed a paternity suit, and Center for Women's Justice joined in an amicus brief in that case, and he won in the lower court. But the state attorney general's office appealed that decision and won, arguing that the family court decision may threaten Talia's status, her Jewish status, as perhaps a mamzer. And from this case, we learn that in Israel, the theocracy stigmatizes children. And in Israel, secular state agents, in this case being the the State Attorney General's office and the registrar in the public registration office cooperate with the Theocracy and their involvement with the mamzer status. So that is the first part of my talk, which was to briefly, again, describe the different cases and show how there is chaos in the rabbinic courts. There are no clear rules. The rules are always changing. There are prejudices. However, now what I will talk about is how CWJ responds to this. And we at CWJ talk about the 3 pillars that we use to address these issues. We litigate creatively, we reshape the public discourse, and we do everything we can to try and ensure marital freedom. So this is what we did in the first case, Tzviya's first case. First of all, we did help Tzviya file to close her court case and to release her husband from jail. We helped, we set up a private rabbinical court in which we asked the rabbis to relook at Tzviya's case and see if there was a basis under the halakha, under Jewish law, to declare her marriage over, and which they did. And so we had a ceremony in this private rabbinic court in which the court told Tzviya that in their halachic opinion, in their Jewish law opinion, she was now free to marry. The state does not recognize that decision, but we're hoping that more private courts like this will be set up. And we have, in fact, brought other people into these private courts. And it's just a way of our giving our clients both the psychological satisfaction of having a religious court state that they are no longer married, and it's also a form of civil disobedience. And recently, what we did just recently is we also filed suit for Tzviya in family court for damages against her husband for all the pain and suffering that he's put her through for the past 22 years, and that case is pending. In the second case, in Ella's case, what Nitzan did, actually, Nitzan had just arrived at the Center for Women's Justice when Ella's case appeared at our doorsteps, and we had to file, to stop the court from implementing many of its different orders, which was the order to transfer the children to the custody of the father, for example. And we appealed to the High Rabbinic Court. We had to appeal to the Supreme Court. In all of these cases, we did manage to overturn the decisions of the lower court, which were clearly prejudicial against this woman who was no longer religious. And Ella managed to retain custody of her daughters. She managed to keep her child support, and the penalty that was imposed by the lower court against her for having gone to the police was dismissed. So that's what we did for Ella. In the third case that you saw, which was the case of Rebecca, the woman in the shelter, we managed to cajole the court into cajoling her husband to give her a divorce without having to meet his demand to live next to her husband. I can't really tell you exactly how we managed to do that, but that's just still part of the argument that there are no rules. You don't know when something's going to work and when something's not going to work. And a lot of things that happen in the rabbinic court are just either luck or arbitrary and capricious, and you don't know which one it's going to be. The next case is the case of Masha, the woman from the former Soviet Union who wants to divorce, and her husband agrees to divorce, but the state doesn't want to give her a divorce because they want her to go through another investigation of her Jewish status. So in that particular case, we just yesterday actually filed an appeal to the High Court of Justice, arguing that the rabbinic courts cannot ignore their own regulations and make up new rules. And we don't have a justice system. There's no real law going on here if the rules are changing all the time, and we cannot anticipate what those rules will be, and we cannot act in accordance with those rules. We cannot get married because we don't know if tomorrow perhaps the court will change the rules and we will find ourselves not Jewish. And in this particular case, we cite the work of Lon Fuller, who was a Harvard, I think, law professor, who talked about the morality of the law. And in this case, we're appealing to the High Court of Justice, to the Supreme Court sitting as the High Court of Justice, to argue that there's an extreme violation of natural justice in this particular case. Then in the last case that we presented to you is the case of Talia and Oren, the father and daughter team. And what we did in that, what we're doing for her is we've also appealed to the Supreme Court to reverse the district court's reversal of the family court decision. In other words, the family court held that he was the psychological father of Talia. The district court said there's no such thing as psychological father. And we've now appealed that case and are making some arguments with respect to parentage and how we think the court should relate to a person who in this particular case, the biological parent of the child, but certainly the psychological parent too. And we are arguing that the state should split the status of children. So one can prove that they are the biological father in the civil court, and that decision doesn't necessarily have to be what will be decided by the religious courts. In other words, there should be a split status, the way that someone can be Jewish for the purposes of coming to Israel and not Jewish for the purposes of marrying. In the same way, the child can be the child of a man for civil purposes and not the child of that father for religious purposes. Well, and we are actually doing a lot of work with respect to the issue of mamzer in the Center for Women's Justice, because we think that the issue of mamzer is really the key to solving the whole problem of the Agunah. And it's a problem which none of the other organizations dealing with the problem of women in divorce are focusing in on. And we think that if we can solve that, then everything else will fall into place. But what we've done is we've set up a collective of leaders and of religious leaders and academics and activists who are working to change the way the state is relating to mamzerim, children stigmatized out of no fault of their own, and are arguing actually for the split status. And in a few weeks' time, we're holding a conference with the Israel Democracy Institute on this very issue and on legislation that we've proposed to change the population registry law. So that is what we're doing. And I'd like just to say that CWJ is reshaping public discourse. It's challenging the courts, and it's to respond to the violations in the religious courts, challenging the secular courts to find responses to them, and we're finding creative solutions for our clients. We at the Center for Women's Justice highlight the problem of religious and state entanglement. We don't want a better rabbinate. We want no state rabbinate. We think everyone should choose their own rabbi, Knei L'cha Rav. We encourage civil disobedience. We have turned a religious right into a civil wrong. We challenge the common sense. And as I said in the video, we don't think the problem is bad husbands or bad rabbis or bad religious laws. The problem is the entanglement of religion and state that is fatally flawed, that compromises democratic principles and the human rights for all of us. On an optimistic note, civil society in Israel and the grassroots objections of people on the ground are slowly making changes, and we ask you to join us in this fight. And thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you. So firstly, thank you to everybody who's raised some questions in the chat. Feel free to add further questions in the chat, and we'll do our best to respond to them. So I'm going to choose a couple of questions that people have asked Susan, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. So Jackie has asked whether the ultimate goal is to change divorce laws to have the civil law be supreme over the rabbinic courts.
From my perspective, yes. I think that there should be civil marriage and divorce in the state of Israel. I would prefer a situation more like what happens in America, where everyone can decide how they get married. And if they feel that they need a religious divorce, that should be a private decision, but not something coerced by the state. So yes, the answer to that question is yes.
And Rabbi Potasnik, I believe you have a question for us as well.
Oh, thank you so much. Firstly, thank you for the presentation and the great work you do. I also want to apologize. We're proud to be part of the faith community, and it's shameful that people in the name of religion would commit such unjust acts as holding women hostage. It's just not right. It's not what we think religion should represent. So the question is, how can we strengthen your voice? We in the diaspora, I mentioned we have some 750 rabbis who are members of the New York board. We're now forming an international conference of rabbis, pluralistic rabbinate around the world. And tell us how we can be a benefit to you by strengthening, your presence.
Well, I think that this would probably require, it would be a good idea if there were a think tank were put together to think about how to answer that question the best. But my guess is that when public servants or members of the Knesset or Israelis come to Israel, I think you have to ask them how they are addressing this question and how they are answering this question, and that would be wonderful. And of course, supporting the Center for Women's Justice and anyone else who's working in to make change. But I do think there are ways to write your congressman and to do more things when Israelis come to Israel. And I definitely think that because we're afraid to, I think a lot of us are afraid to criticize the state because there's so much criticism of the state anyway. So we tiptoe around issues when we shouldn't be. And I think that we have to better articulate, the more people understand what's really happening, I think that the more we can help make change. But we do need a think tank to answer that question better, I think. Do
you have a rabbinic advisory board or such a thing in possibility? Creating
I'm happy to make you the head of that.
I need more work, but no, let's continue that.
I think that's a great idea.
I think there's a place for, to show that there's real opposition. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Let's definitely continue that conversation for sure. Rabbi Menachem Creditor has asked who our partners on the ground here in Israel are. So would you like me to answer?
Yeah, if you would like to answer. I think we have one of our key partners. We have a bunch of partners, and we often partner with some of the other women's organizations working in this area. But Chupot, for example, is a very interesting partner that we have. Chupot is an organization that conducts religious ceremonies outside of the rabbinate, and they use our prenuptial agreement when they marry couples. So we have a very, very close relationship with them. Who were you thinking of, Michelle?
We also partner with, so Chupot, they run religious ceremonies, Orthodox religious ceremonies. It's Orthodox rabbis and Orthodox women scholars. That's on one side. And on the other side, we actually partner with Yisrael Chofshit, which is, I think, Free Israel, which is a very secular Israeli organization promoting civil marriage and divorce, because we also have a prenuptial agreement for couples who marry not in accordance with Jewish law, because believe it or not, even a couple who gets married in a civil ceremony in Cyprus, if they're both Jewish, if they come to get divorced, even they have to go through the rabbinate. So they can also find they're back to, they can find themselves back to square one in dealing with this Agunah issue, this issue of women being denied a divorce. So we work with Israel Chofshi to make those kinds of couples aware of the issues too. And like Susan said, we partner with many of the women's organizations. We partner with Kolech, we partner with Mavoi Zitum. We partner really with anyone who we have common goals with, and that can
with the Israel Democracy Institute. Now we're cooperating for this conference, which will be held in a few weeks, and should be also hopefully filmed, right?
Yeah, we'd love to share that. So Stephanie has also asked whether we've seen any changes in the attitudes of the civil courts.
I think that we've seen a lot of changes, actually, especially on the ground. Just the number of people that are no longer choosing to get married in the rabbinate for all sorts of reasons. I think the cases that the precedents that we set for damages have changed the playing field in Israel completely. And I think that while that is very important, and it's a tool that all attorneys use at this point in time in Israel, I think that it's really the language that the public awareness has changed. In other words, it used to be boys will be boys. This is what men do when they want to get divorced. But now people understand that it's really a civil wrong. And I think it's also very interesting that I think this is a worldwide phenomenon, that it's the secular courts that are responding to these issues. In other words, just now we see the British courts have held that a man who's withheld a get, is criminally, has undergone a criminal act, has done a criminal act. And I think that's one of the things that we can learn also, that change is probably not going to happen from within the halakha. I think change will most probably happen by pressure from secular courts and also by a re-articulation of the problem.
Jackie had a question regarding how we can change these laws, whether the changes in these laws is something that can only be done in the Knesset or even a national referendum.
Ultimately, I think, if civil marriage is instituted in Israel, I think it will have to come through the Knesset eventually. Right now, that probably will not happen, although there is push, if not to have only civil marriage and divorce in Israel, to at least have a parallel, have one system where people can choose whether they want to officially marry by the state in accordance with religious rules or through a secular system. And I think the Israel Democracy Institute is also pushing for that, those parallel lines. I don't know when that will happen. I think eventually it will have to happen, but I don't see it happening tomorrow. It could be that I'm very hopeful about the law that we're proposing with respect to mamzer, though. I am hopeful about that. Because we're getting a lot of support also from the Democracy Institute and also from members of the Knesset, like Rabbi Gilad Kariv. And so there, I think we have a chance. That would be really nice if we get that through. The split status law that I spoke about.
Thank you. Stephanie, do we have time for one more question, or yeah?
Yes.
Okay. So I'll ask this question. First, we had a question from Carly Pildis. How can people in America on the ground support what we do? So actually, Carly herself is an amazing example of someone who supports CWJ. Carly, from what I remember, if I'm correct, Rachel, Carly is familiar with our work through Twitter. and is an avid supporter of us and shares everything that we do on social media. And we really consider Carly a true ambassador of CWJ. So, you know, it's especially if you are influential on social media, you are influential in your communities, anything that you can do to raise awareness, to elevate the work that we do here in Israel, is a big help to us. The first step is raising awareness of the injustices in order to spark grassroots demand for change. And that's really what we want to see happening in tandem with our litigation and our kind of top-down approach. We need the change also to come from the grassroots, from bottom up.
Michelle, I think Esther had a question, or she was Esther Mackner, right? Did you? And also that we have a TikTok supporter. Did everyone see the TikTok shout out for us? So share that. That would be wonderful to share that TikTok shout out for us from the Daf Yomi lady.
Daf reactions, yeah.
Sorry. Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, my question is this: here in the diaspora, we have the separation of religion and state. And in fact, my efforts in California, and we succeeded in having coercive control deemed domestic violence, our efforts are going in the opposite direction. We want the state to recognize that there are gender-based inequities that are rooted in religion. And just because it's rooted in religion, these people should not be immunized from the control of the state. So we're moving in the other direction because.
Well, okay. I don't think I think we're still in tandem. I don't think we're in opposite directions, actually, because we're also, even if we were hopefully get to the place where we have civil marriage and divorce in Israel, we would still want the secular courts to respond to these injustices. So we, to a large extent, agree with you. In other words, we agree that, especially in Israel, I think the state could easily take the position, which it already has here, that withholding a religious divorce is a civil wrong or a crime, or domestic violence, as you stated. That's not a problem. But the state doesn't have to create agunot. I joke in the office all the time that in Israel, every single woman who gets married, not only Jewish women, Muslim women and Catholic women who gets married in Israel is an agunah. In other words, every woman in Israel was subject to religious laws, is coerced into religious laws. Okay, she must marry only in accordance with religious laws, cannot get out of her marriage without her husband's permission. So there's little nuances between the different types of agunot, but there's a big difference if the state makes everyone an agunah, if the state requires every woman to get married in a religious marriage and divorce, in a religious marriage, which requires a religious divorce, and the religious divorce requires the husband's agreement for the divorce. So in effect, by definition, the state has created agunot, by its very numbers. So I don't exactly agree with you, Esther, in the way you've characterized this. So you're lucky in you're working steadfastly for religious women who want the state to help them find a solution to get out of their bad marriages. But at least you don't have to deal with the secular Jewish woman who doesn't want to be in that position in the first instance. And we do think the state, especially in Israel, can help out. And I said that before, that the secular courts are the ones who are rising to the occasion and helping out much more than the religious establishment is doing that.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm just going to jump in here. I'm mindful of the time, and I I know this could go on, and there's so much to say, and there's so much to absorb. So I just want to thank all of you for taking time out of your day, evening for some, to learn about these very, very important issues. My heartfelt thanks to the work that you continue to do at CWJ. And again, a real privilege to work with you. And I look forward to really elevating this conversation more. I just want you to know, so it's not going to be a surprise, that you will be receiving a follow-up email from Michelle and Susan to talk about next steps. And so as you leave this conversation, if you could just put on your thinking cap about ways that we could elevate CWJ's profile here in the States, just so I know our plates are very full with so many issues that are going on, and especially now with what's going on in the Ukraine. However, these are day-to-day issues that you all have been dealing with in Israel for decades now, let alone how many years before that. So I just want to thank you. Please take time to have a little lunch or dinner wherever you are, since this is a lunch and learn. And I wish you all shalom, peace as you go through your days. And again, thank you for your time. That is, of course, something that is so precious. Thank you. Thank you to all.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for hosting us.
Absolutely.
Thank you.